A century ago, Venezuela found the one resource powerful enough to change its fate and dangerous enough to control it: oil. Not the light, easy kind, but thick, tar-like crude buried deep beneath jungles and rivers. By the 1930s, foreign companies from Britain, the Netherlands, and the US had carved wells across the Maracaibo Basin. For every barrel exported, pipelines of wealth flowed into a country that had once survived on coffee and cacao. By 1950, Venezuela's income per person was higher than Japan's. Caracas glittered with new highways, neon lights, and jazz clubs. The nation joined OPEC as a founding member in 1960, promising to use its black gold to fund prosperity for generations. But easy money breeds complacency. When the state earns from wells instead of citizens, power flows upward, not outward. By the 1970s, Venezuela was rich but unproductive. Its farmers abandoned fields, its factories slowed, and its government became addicted to oil royalties. When President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the industry in 1976, he declared, "The oil is ours." Technically, he was right, but as every generation since learned, owning oil isn't the same as mastering it. In the 1980s, the illusion of endless wealth shattered. Oil prices collapsed from $40 to under $10 a barrel. Suddenly, a government used to abundance faced scarcity. To meet its bills, it borrowed heavily from foreign banks, triggering a debt spiral. Imports shrank, unemployment rose, and the streets erupted. In 1989, when fuel subsidies were slashed, protests known as the Caracazo left hundreds dead. For many Venezuelans, the message was clear. Globalization had failed them, and the elite would always be shielded. That anger simmered until a young army officer named Hugo Chavez tried to seize power in 1992. He failed, but became a symbol of resistance. By the time he was elected president in 1998, voters weren't chasing prosperity. They were chasing revenge. They wanted oil to serve the people again. Chavez promised to deliver. He renegotiated contracts, raised royalties, and redirected billions into social programs that reduced poverty by half within a decade. For a time, it worked because oil prices soared above $100. But when one product funds everything, prosperity becomes hostage to a chart. When the US government wants to punish a state without firing a shot, it uses its most powerful tool, the dollar. By 2017, Washington accused Caracas of corruption, repression, and electoral fraud. Sanctions followed. PDVSA, once among the world's 10 largest oil companies, was cut off from international credit. No U.S. bank could process its transactions. No bond trader could touch its debt. For a country whose currency already collapsed from hyperinflation, losing access to the dollar was like losing oxygen. Imports froze. Fuel shipments stalled. Pharmaceutical warehouses went empty. And as the Bolivar imploded, dollars began to circulate informally. What was once contraband became lifeline. To Washington, sanctions were pressure for democracy. To Venezuelans, they felt like collective punishment. Doctors couldn't import insulin. Power plants lacked parts. Even humanitarian channels tangled in paperwork as banks overcomplied to avoid fines. But economics rarely stays moral for long. Global oil prices began to rise again, and the U.S. faced a choice: uphold pressure or manage prices. When domestic gas reached $4 a gallon, the moral calculus shifted. By 2022, Washington quietly issued narrow waivers. Chevron, once banned, returned under supervision to extract oil strictly for debt repayment. Cash was forbidden, but barrels could flow. The US called it targeted engagement. Caracas called it proof that oil still rules foreign policy. When formal systems die, informal ones take their place. Across Venezuela, people built microeconomies the government couldn't tax or control. Farmers traded eggs for diesel. Teachers accepted food instead of salaries. The black market became the real market. By 2020, nearly 70% of transactions used US dollars, a currency technically illegal, but quietly tolerated. It stopped hyperinflation faster than any policy ever could. For ordinary citizens, the dollar wasn't politics, it was survival. Yet beneath the stabilization lurked dependence. An economy rebuilt on foreign cash isn't sovereign, it's improvised. And while the US debated human rights, China quietly built contracts. While Washington closed doors, Beijing opened them, not with aid, but with contracts. Between 2007 and 2014, China lent Venezuela more than $60 billion, mostly secured by oil deliveries. For every barrel shipped east, debt ticked down. At its peak, tankers left Caribbean ports daily, bound for China's refineries. It was called loans for oil diplomacy, simple, transactional, and free of lectures about governance. China financed railways, power plants, and housing projects, many never completed, but politically invaluable. For Beijing, the goal wasn't immediate profit. It was a long-term foothold in America's backyard, a demonstration that the US no longer monopolized influence in the Western Hemisphere. As Venezuela's debt grew, repayment terms blurred. Oil shipments counted as installments, but maintenance costs and price fluctuations muddied the ledger. By 2021, Venezuela owed China roughly $19 billion. But Beijing wasn't demanding cash. It was demanding access, ports, logistics, and political alignment. China never built military bases in Venezuela. It didn't need to. Influence came through infrastructure and data. Chinese telecom firms installed surveillance systems in Caracas. State broadcasters aired Chinese documentaries dubbed in Spanish. Technical advisors trained local engineers to run refineries the West could no longer service. To Venezuelans exhausted by crisis, China represented efficiency, an alternative that worked. To Washington, it looked like encroachment, and to Beijing, it was proof that economic power travels farther than warships. By the mid-2020s, Venezuela had quietly become a node in a larger network, not a client state, but a case study in what multipolarity actually looks like. Survival through diversification. By 2016, PDVSA was a name engraved on every fuel station and every budget sheet. But no longer the technological giant that once trained engineers around the world. Years of political appointments replaced specialists with loyalists. Maintenance funds diverted into social programs and campaigns. Critical spare parts rotted on shipping docks. Heavy crude needs precision, diluents to thin it, hydrogen to upgrade it, and foreign partners to refine it. All three vanished. Production collapsed from 3.2 million barrels a day to barely 700,000. Pipelines corroded. Refineries caught fire for lack of valves. The company that had funded a continent could no longer fuel its own buses. When gas stations ran dry in a country floating on oil, the absurdity was complete. Technicians who once earned global salaries fled abroad, to Colombia, Texas, Qatar, creating a brain drain that no policy could reverse. PDVSA became a monument to how politics can hollow out competence faster than markets can recover it. When oil dollars disappeared, the jungle filled the void. In the Amazonian South, miners with pickaxes and pumps turned riverbanks to sludge. Mercury poisoned waterways. Armed groups taxed every gram. Gold was the new currency, portable, uncensored, untaxed. The state looked away because it needed the metal to survive. Gold bars were flown to Turkey and the UAE, sold for cash that re-entered as food imports. For local communities, the environmental cost was irreversible. Forests cleared, rivers sterile, wildlife gone. Every boomtown had its own law. Uniforms changed, but extortion did not. In this Arco Minero, a new state emerged, one that ran on survival and smuggling instead of tax and law. Crisis doesn't stay home. Over 7 million Venezuelans have left since 2015, the largest migration in modern Latin American history. Families walked across Andean passes, carrying suitcases and infants. Doctors became taxi drivers in Peru. Teachers cleaned homes in Chile. Entire neighborhoods in Caracas fell silent, their lights out not from blackouts but departure. Yet remittances from abroad became the lifeline for those who stayed. $4 billion a year flowing back through apps and money orders. Neighboring countries strained to cope. Colombia opened its schools to Venezuelan children. Brazil built shelters in Roraima. The crisis redrew politics across a continent that once called itself Bolivarian, now united only by exhaustion. While people moved north, barrels moved east. Venezuela's heavy crude is so thick that only a few refineries on Earth can handle it, most of them in the U.S. Gulf Coast. Sanctions cut that link, forcing tankers to China and India through a maze of intermediaries. Cargo manifests were altered, AIS signals switched off, bills of lading rewritten. Each extra hop meant lost revenue and added risk. Yet the barrels kept flowing because stopping them would mean state collapse. At home, fuel shortages remained severe. Drivers queued for days for rationed gasoline. Refining capacity had fallen so low that Iran stepped in to supply additives and technical parts in exchange for gold. Global energy markets barely noticed these workarounds, but for economists, they showed how resilient a petrostate can be when politics makes rules and physics demands fuel. A new class of ships haunts the oceans, the dark fleet. Tankers decades old, bought cheap through shell companies registered from Dubai to Panama. Their transponders blink off mid-voyage. Oil is transferred between vessels in international waters. Paperwork changes overnight. Analysts call it the largest sanctions evasion network since Iraq in the 1990s. Governments call it a nightmare. Each cargo risks environmental disaster, but the profit margins are too good to resist. Insurance companies pretend not to see. Port authorities look the other way. When every nation wants cheap fuel, morality takes a backseat to supply. China doesn't need to station troops in Venezuela to project power. It uses fiber optic cables, telecom contracts, and surveillance systems. Huawei and ZTE built much of the nation's digital infrastructure. Satellite links and facial recognition networks became tools of both security and control. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy increased Caribbean patrols, framed as anti-narcotics missions, but serving as reminders of who still dominates the seas. Both powers avoid direct conflict, preferring to contest in invisible space: data, currency, logistics. It's a new kind of Cold War, fought not with ideology, but with infrastructure. Every collapse invites two kinds of architects: those who rebuild and those who rearrange the rubble. Venezuela now faces both. Economists describe 5 levers that could lift the nation from stagnation without surrendering its sovereignty. First, transparency. PDVSA's books must open to sunlight. Production data, debt ledgers, contract terms, all published in real time. Secrecy built the crisis. Visibility could rebuild trust. Second, energy rehabilitation. Decaying refineries can't restart on slogans. They need foreign partnerships, technical audits, and honest cost accounting. Iran, China, and Chevron have the pieces. Coordination is the difference between recovery and relapse. Third, fiscal reset. Inflation destroyed faith in money. Re-anchoring the currency to credible revenue, even partially to oil exports or remittances, would slow price spirals. Fourth, social infrastructure. Before debt payments, electricity, and hospitals. No investor believes in a country its citizens are fleeing. Fifth, environmental compensation. The arco minero must shift from extraction to restoration. Global carbon credit markets could fund cleanup and prove that reform pays. Together, these levers wouldn't erase corruption or geopolitics, but they could make the system livable again. A foundation strong enough for policy instead of improvisation. Every negotiation hides a different clock. Washington's counts election cycles. Beijing's counts decades. Caracas's counts days until the next tanker sails. The United States wants stability that fits its narrative. Human rights statements, limited elections, and oil supply that lowers domestic gasoline prices. China wants repayment and reliability, a partner that honors contracts, not headlines. Venezuela's leadership wants guarantees. No coups, no extraditions, no sudden freezes. Any durable settlement must give each side just enough success to claim victory. That is diplomacy's real currency. Mutual illusion managed by logistics. Analysts outline 3 scenarios for Venezuela's next decade. They aren't predictions, they're warnings. Scenario A, managed normalization. Gradual sanctions relief matched to electoral and governance milestones. Oil output climbs to 2 million barrels a day. Inflation slows. Migration reverses slightly. Risk reform fatigue once prices rise again. Scenario B, sanctions whiplash. Talks collapse. Enforcement tightens. Gray markets expand eastward. Short-term resilience hides long-term decay. Infrastructure deteriorates beyond repair. Risk, humanitarian collapse and another wave of refugees. Scenario C, quiet grand bargain. Oil for debt agreements under multilateral oversight. Environmental safeguards. Gradual political opening. No one claims victory, but markets stabilize and the hemisphere exhales. Risk, slow drift toward dependency on external mediators. Each future balances risk and hope on the same fulcrum, credibility. Without it, every plan is just arithmetic without trust. For decades, debates about Venezuela were measured in barrels, not bodies. But power means nothing if lights don't stay on in hospitals. In barrios outside Maracaibo, families ration electricity by hours. Children study by candlelight. Surgeons operate with phone flashlights. Hyperinflation turned saving into punishment. Migration turned families into remittance networks. Yet beneath exhaustion, something endures. Adaptation. Local cooperatives repair transformers. Teachers run dollar-funded night schools. Farmers rebuild distribution with WhatsApp logistics. These microeconomies show that a nation's true resilience isn't its oil field, but its people. Venezuela's story isn't just about oil. It's about what happens when value and virtue drift apart. When nations measure success in extraction instead of education, they mortgage their future for their present. The US and China see Venezuela as leverage. Investors see it as risk. Historians will see it as a lesson. Because the fight was never only for barrels. It was for who writes the rules when the next crisis comes. Every empire claims its motives are noble. But the truth lies in who benefits when prices rise. Power can be bought, borrowed, or bartered. But stability has to be built. If Venezuela succeeds in rebuilding, it won't be because of foreign policy. It'll be because of ordinary citizens who decided that wealth buried underground isn't worth more than dignity above it. If this story gave you a new lens on how power truly works, hit subscribe, because every fortune hides a secret, and every secret has a price.